Very, very good afternoon to all of you. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to ASSAf's Humanities Book Award webinar, where we gather to celebrate scholarly excellence and reflect on the role of the humanities in shaping our understanding of society. The ASSAf Humanities Book Award is a significant honor. It was established to recognize works of outstanding quality that not only advance scholarship, but also enrich our intellectual and cultural life. The process through which this award is conferred is very rigorous, it's very thoughtful. Nominations are received from across the scholarly community, and each submission undergoes a detailed scrutiny by a panel of 10 humanities scholars to shortlist and then identify awardees. The panel considers a range of criteria: peer review, scholarly originality and rigor, scholarly quality and standing, and the extent to which the book enriches and advances the humanities. This is not a quick or superficial exercise. It's a highly deliberative process. It advances the humanities. And it requires careful reading and rereading and discussion and much debate and reflection. Ultimately, the works that are selected must stand out as transformative contributions, books that open up new conversations, deepen our understandings, and resonate within and beyond the academy. It is through this process that today's honored work was chosen. A book that makes an extraordinary contribution both to scholarship and to our collective memory. The book is Guerrillas and Combative Mothers, Women and the Armed Struggle in South Africa, authored by our speaker today, Professor Siphokazi Magadla. This important work provides a first-hand account of women's participation in the armed struggle against apartheid from 1961 to 1994, and follows their lives in democratic South Africa. It's based on 40 life histories, but it fills a crucial gap in our understanding of the liberation struggle. It amplifies voices that have too often been overlooked, voices of women whose experiences in war, in exile, and even in the new democracy complicate and enrich our narratives of freedom. The book illuminates the intersections of gender, memory, and in so doing, it makes a profound contribution to the fields of political studies, to history, to African feminisms, and others. It's an academic achievement, but it's also a work of deep human resonance. So allow me to briefly introduce the author more fully. Professor Siphokazi Magadla is an associate professor of political and international studies at Rhodes University. Her research focuses on war, gender, African feminisms, and she's become a leading voice in these areas. She serves on various editorial boards and advisory boards, both locally and internationally. Her leadership extends beyond her own scholarship. She's deeply committed to nurturing the next generation of African scholars, mentoring through initiatives such as the Social Science Research Council's Next Generation Social Sciences in Africa Fellowship, and others. Through these roles, she's shaping and supporting a vibrant community of emerging researchers whose work continues to strengthen the humanities in Africa and globally. It's therefore a great privilege to have her with us today. We look forward to hearing her reflections on her award-winning book. Friends, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Siphokazi Magadla. Professor?
Thank you very much, Professor Pillay. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the Academy of Science of South Africa for this moving recognition and this moving introduction, Professor Pillay and the ASSAf Humanities Book Award Committee, which read, as you have laid out, which read our books with curiosity, rigor, and care. Thank you too to Mamputi Ramete for her excellent coordination throughout this entire process. Thank you to my colleague, Professor Sue McKenna, who engaged, cheered, and nominated Guerrillas and Combative Mothers for this award. Thank you too to my publisher, the University of KwaZulu-Natal Press, led by Dr. Pindile Dlamini, for a wonderfully womaned process. I see you, Sally Hines. I see you, Sqedi Limbambo. Thank you so much. I will come back to UKZN Press anytime. Thank you to the elders, the colleagues, friends, students, and everyone who has joined this room from the different parts of this country and the world. It is a joy to share this prize with Professor Hugo Guggenheim, whose majestic book, Riotous Deathscape, has given us a language of what it feels like to fashion death for life for the abandoned of the world. As I've said to Professor Cunningham, his book reminds me of Cornel West's concept of a blues sensibility, when Cunningham argues that the people of Emambondweni live with devastation, but they relish life. Since its publication in February 2023, I have presented about this book for about 20 times, and this occasion is its 21st birthday, is its 21st presentation. I wish to express my deep gratitude to the communities that have received this work, who have critically engaged it in ways that have clarified and raised new questions for me as I continue to think about traditions and legacies of liberation towards social change. From Makanda to Gqeberha, Johannesburg, Cape Town, San Francisco, Addis Ababa, Oxford, and Shanghai, among the physical and virtual discussions of this work, all of them have affirmed my view of intellectual work as village work. It is these communities that have been at the center of my intellectual life. They understand, as Nomalanga Mkhize does, and I quote, that the task of the educated African person is not to sit, it is to build, ukufukuza. For Mkhize, ukufukuza is based on the umbilical sense of where to find our knowledge, buried in our histories, our mythologies, our languages, in the ways in which our grandmothers and grandfathers and communities have brought us up. What Baba Alwama Goqwana and Atambile Masola and I referred to as survival wisdom in the volume Inyati Ibuzwa Kwabaphambili, Theorizing South African Women's Intellectual Legacies. It is in this tradition that I place Guerrillas and Combative Mothers in a lineage of African women's ways of ukufukuza, and as having been enabled by a transnational and intergenerational project of ukufukuzela. It is this community that has embodied for me what Toni Morrison meant by standing at the border, standing at the edge and claiming it as central, letting the rest of the world move over to where you are. It is these communities that I say have made me a person. Indenze umntu. Guerrillas and Combative Mothers tells the story of 40 women who participated in South Africa's armed struggle from 1961 to 1994, and of their lives in democratic South Africa. It provides accounts of the women who were formally trained in guerrilla warfare in Umkhonto weSizwe, the ANC's military wing, and the combative mothers who received no military training and participated in the rural-based insurrection of the Pan-Africanist Congress's armed wing, POCO, in 1963, and the township-based defense units in the 1980s, who made the country ungovernable, leading to the final years of apartheid. It does so to make the argument that through their experiences, it is possible to see the contours of South Africa's armed struggle in the homes, schools, churches, funerals, and all spaces of social life where apartheid violence was felt daily and ultimately resisted. Women's roles across the eras of struggle, across geographical spaces, and across generations illuminate their ability to take up arms and claim equal right to the fight for liberation. Women transformed and democratized the liberation movements and laid the foundation for the codification of gender equality in democratic South Africa. The recently late Maxi Skuman and Yolanda Sadi point out that the issue of gender has become, for all intents and purposes, acceptable and a part of what post-apartheid South Africa claims to be about. The book argues that this is so because of women's agency, commitment, beliefs, and actions. Nayam Inayatullah explains that theoretical decisions emerge from the theorist's needs and wounds. My interest on what women did when the ANC changed its 5-decade commitment to non-violence towards armed struggle did not begin with a natural interest about what women made of the dramatic political changes that followed the banning of the ANC and the PAC in April 1960. My interest began at home, growing up in a home where my father had recently left the newly established South African National Defence Force to build a new life that began with a doomed venture into the taxi industry as an owner of a new Toyota Venture. This man that I had watched shining his military shoes in the morning, whistling excitedly at the start of a new day, was reduced to a life of sitting around with fellow former soldiers, reminiscing about their lives in the military. This image of former military men, whom Sasha Gier argues were spat out like morning mucus during the military integration process that integrated the Apartheid Defense Force, the Bantustan Defense Force, and the military wings of the ANC and PAC, set side by side with the image of my own mother returning from work, exhausted, after yet another day from the psychiatric ward at the Mthatha General Hospital. She would come home with stories of former military men that had to be pinned down to the floor to be injected to calm their minds. It was from my father that I heard of the case of Lieutenant Sibusiso Madubela, who shot dead 6 white SANDF members, including a white civilian woman, at the Tempe military base in Bloemfontein on the 9th of September in 1999. None of my mother's and father's stories featured stories about women soldiers. My childhood was made up of images of former military men who seemed to yearn for the past, while other adults embraced the possibilities of a new democratic future. This experience is how I come to ask questions about gender and war and gender and militarisms. I share this to say that these personal burdens can profoundly shape the questions that we ask in our scholarly work, because they speak honestly from an umbilical sense, to use Mkhize's term, the ability to theorize from the navel is important in sustaining a dynamic social sciences and humanities project. My life was changed in 2010 when I had the opportunity to interview former Minister Thandi Modise about her role as the first chairperson of the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Defense, as well as retired Major General Nzikimemela Mutumi, who was the Chief Director for Transformation and Management in the South African National Defence Force, for a documentary project on women in the security sector in South Africa. Modise explained that she joined Umkhonto weSizwe to fight against Bantu education and Bantu authority in Mahikeng in the Northwest, and to fight for justice for the rape that she experienced at the age of 15. As a young woman, even then, she understood that her fight for national liberation would take place on multiple fronts. She says, I was in Mahikeng at Barolong High School. We then discussed as students and decided that even though Barolong High School as such was not going to be affected by the Africans, we had another monster looming. Mangope, who became the leader of the Bantustan of Bophuthatswana, was preparing for his Bophuthatswana. Suddenly, without consultation, we were going to be taken away from our own country, be parceled into what was to be Bophuthatswana. We were, without being consulted, losing our citizenship. I left the country a young woman waiting to go and do battle, as I said, for the two reasons: education and the retention of my citizenship. But I also wanted to fight because at the age of 15, I'd been raped, I'd been impregnated, the courts failed me and my mother. I then decided I wasn't going to pursue school. I was going to join Umkhonto weSizwe. In fact, that's what I went on to do. I fought to be a woman, even in the ANC military camps, that it was correct for women to take up arms because certain battles, we believed even then, that they could only be won, they could only be understood by other women. End quote. Modise spoke passionately about how her experience as a woman in MK shaped her views about what needed to be done to democratically transform the new South African Defence Force. She spoke about what it meant for guerrillas to wear uniforms designed for men and shoes designed for men. Another MK, former guerrilla Naomi Ribbon Mushodi, spoke about the challenges of making sure that women's underwear was available in MK camps in Angola. She tells a story of how an MK man was sent to buy underwear for soldiers in Botswana, but was too embarrassed to buy women's underwear. So in the end, the women had to wear jockeys like the men. This is the experience that shaped these former guerrillas to ensure that the new defense force was going to be gender friendly, from the uniforms to the military equipment, including seats for pilots. This is why I insist that to understand the success of women such as Major Mandi Samveka, who is the first Black South African woman combat pilot, we need to trace her lineage through figures such as Modise, such as Jackie Sedibe, and Nzikimemela Mutumi, among others, who worked through parliament through the Defense Force to make sure that the new force would be a space where women could imagine careers in democratic South Africa. Through the life histories of 22 MK women out of the 40, the book traces their politicization, their activism, and the defining moments that led to them choosing the armed struggle as a site of their political participation. For instance, Nkosazana Xaba, who is known to many of us in this room for her poetry, her short stories, and her work on Noni Jabavu, Xaba traces her decision to join Umkhonto weSizwe to the 29th October 1983 Ongoye massacre. She states, I can point to a date on the 29th of October 1983. Members of Inkatha Impi came to university at Ongoye. By the end of that day, 4 students had died and 1 other person. I made the decision on that day that I'll be looking to join. I was never recruited to MK. On that day, I decided I will ask people until somebody tells me who to talk to. That's how I joined MK. It was self-preservation, because what I realized on that day is that if I don't do something to know how to kill and fight back, I'll die, and that would be, for me, a failure on my part, not to have armed myself when experience has shown me that I need to be ready to fight and die fighting. I did not want to die not fighting. End quote. The passing of Gatsha Buthelezi has revived questions about the violence in the Natal Midlands, what is speakable, and so much more that remains unspeakable. Xolisi Mchunu's book, Violence and Solace, The Natal Civil War in the Late Apartheid South Africa, also published by UKZN Press, has convinced me that when it comes to this history, death walks everywhere with people in South Africa, and especially so in KwaZulu-Natal. Here, I borrow from a statement made by the anthropologist Carolyn Nordstrom in her book, Shadows of War, when she recalls asking a nurse in Angola about what one needed to know to understand that country. The nurse responded, "You need to understand death. Everyone here is on an intimate terms with death. Everyone has lost someone they love to the war. Death walks everywhere with people." It is my view that if we want to understand why South Africa's death rates are comparable to countries in war, we need to revisit this history through the eyes of the generations that survived it. In Mchunu's case, he was 8 years old when the war broke out in Kwashange. Through his PhD and the book, he tells the story of the war in Kwashange through his eyes and that of his mother. I am currently supervising a master's thesis that explores how young people born after the year 2000, AMA 2000, in Umlazi, have come to learn about Udlame and how this shapes their political consciousness. Guerrillas and Combative Mothers Guerrillas and Combative Mothers follows MK women through their journey to exile their choice of combat names, their impressions of the countries that they passed through, daily life in the military, leadership, reproductive access, and sexual violence, and their participation in combat. The book argues that ultimately the presence of women changed MK and raised the question of gender equality. This is why Thenjiwe Mdidzo boldly declares that MK over time also became less patriarchal. If you look at MK in its last days, and I was one of those in its last days in Uganda. Mdidzo was the MK regional commander and the ANC representative in Uganda. It is no coincidence that Mdidzo became South Africa's first chairperson of the Commission for Gender Equality. By tracing MK women's distinctive impact as policymakers and strategists that transformed the new Defence Force towards gender equality, the book shows that MK women drew directly from their experience as guerrillas to transform the security sector. This transformation does not happen on its own. It is initiated and implemented by women. This is why Khanyisile Linchfield Chabalala claimed in an interview with Nziki Mazwai that MK women, in fact, liberated white women in the SNDF. The book importantly goes beyond a focus on the transnational MK women. In fact, I make the point that MK women guerrillas were the exception, not the rule, in terms of how women participated in the armed struggle. The combative mothers and young women in the townships and the homelands were the rule in terms of how the majority of women participated in the armed struggle. The chapter on combative motherhood shows that Winnie Madikizela Mandela's form of combative motherhood was not an exception, but the rule for the internally based women combatants. By focusing on the role of Poqo women in the 1960s, the book shows that women participated in the armed struggle from the onset, including the rural-based Poqo insurrections that have been theorized by scholars such as Tom Lodge and Kwandiwe Nkondlo, among others. The focus on Poqo women in Mkanduli shifts the focus and emphasis on urban-based combatants. It also shows continuities and ruptures in forms of resistance across the 1960s, 70s, and 1980s that shaped the militancy of women in the township uprisings of 1980. For instance, Zoleka Mandela, who is the daughter of Zinzi Mandela, describes how her mother could strip and assemble an AK-47 in 38 seconds. She recalls that her grandmother referred to their home as a transit camp, which was being used to recruit for Umkhonto weSizwe. She then describes an incident that her mother, Zinzi, often talked about with pride, how Zoleka hid a grenade when they were stopped by the police on their way to fetch Madikizela Mandela from the airport. She says, "My grandmother describes how on this particular day, a day on which my mother had a hand grenade in her possession, I spared her a life sentence. I am told that on the return trip, when the car in which we were traveling was surrounded by the police, I boldly offered to conceal a hand grenade in my school bag. Even at the age of 9, I knew that my bag would be the last place that the police would look, end quote. Zoleka Mandela explains that her mother spoke proudly of her daughter's ability to evade the police. It always felt like something important to her. In her eyes, it was something I should have been extremely proud of. Perhaps this is because Zinzi Mandela was the child of parents whose lives were entirely sacrificed to the struggle for national liberation, understood that her own 9-year-old daughter needed to be able to defend herself from the police. Perhaps like herself, Zinzi Mandela foresaw that her daughter would one day need to be able to strip and assemble a weapon in a few seconds. By illuminating the role of women in the township uprisings, in the paramilitary self-defense units of paramilitary defense unit Amabutho in Gqeberha, the book expands definitions of combat beyond a narrow focus on exile-trained women and men. I argue that examining women's role in insurrections against Bantu authority in the 1960s and their role at the time of ungovernability in the 1980s allows us to appreciate the intersections between political tradition, militancy, and maternal politics for social change. I have been asked at various book discussions what it means to look at women from the ANC, the PAC, and women in the SDUs, the self-defense units. My view is that, just like Cynthia Enloe has argued, that we should not create false hierarchies between the woman soldier, the military wife, and the sex worker in the military effort. Yolande Booker has done the same in the African context to argue that we should not create false hierarchies between women combatants. While the MK women are the most visible, it remains true that just like the women in Azanla, APLA, and the SDUs, they are, as Thandi Modise proclaimed in the 2021 colloquium on women and 60 years of the armed struggle, she proclaimed that women as a category are brushed out of history of the armed struggle. It is true that in academic literature and public culture, women combatants as a group are brushed out of armed struggle history. It is 30 years on that we are finally seeing an increase in the number of women former liberation fighters who are publishing their memoirs. Ruth Mandile's I Survived, Evolved Against All Odds broke new ground when it was published in 2019, as I detail in the book. I'm currently developing an article that reads Mandile's memoir with 2 other MK women's memoirs that we published in 2024. That is Sikosem G's On the Stage of Time and Marion Sparks' Guilty and Proud, an MK soldier's memoir of exile, prison, and freedom. My current project here as the fellow of the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies is an edited volume that brings together chapters written by 17 women former liberation fighters from MK, APLA, and Azanla. It is our hope that this book may be published next year when the country marks the 65th anniversary of the armed struggle. Jacqueline Koch explains that the MK guerrilla became a popular mass image of the strong, liberated woman. In the chapter about the lives of women after 1994, the book shows that while some women combatants occupy positions such as ambassadors, CEOs, writers, civil servants, domestic workers, among others, the majority of the women former liberation fighters remain poor, just like the majority of South African women. To make sense of their experience, I use Phumla Gqola's concept of the new South African woman, who combines women's found political equality with corporatized ideas of women's economic empowerment that represent desirable elite heterosexual womanhood, to point out that former women guerrillas no longer serve as the image of the strong, liberated woman. I argue that their lives after apartheid have moved from a life dedicated to struggle of umzabalazo to a life of hustling, ukutabalaza, in the informal economy for the survival of their families and community. Like the majority of African women, they hustle in the margins of the neoliberal economy that relies on the cheapening of their labor. I examine women's integration within their families, community, and the nature of their political involvement today, and the nature of support that they receive from the state. I argue that women former guerrillas face the double pressure to be strong as Black women and to be strong as former guerrillas. The trope of the strong Black woman allows the state and community to dismiss women's real and urgent material and psychological needs. Socially, when some of these women have threatened to use their military training in the public space, such as the case when Lindiwe Zulu threatened an EFF man to a physical fight, she was labeled by Julius Malema as a strat maid. This perception of former women combatants is similar to those of women in liberation armies in Zimbabwe, Namibia, Mozambique, for example, who are told that they are not feminine enough in the post-war society. The final chapter also surfaces the behaviors and habits that women guerrillas live with as a result of their participation in the armed struggle. For instance, Nomsangwepe said that at her workplace, she is perceived differently to her colleagues because of her military past. She says, I mean, even at work, in a meeting, we would be debating, and if there's something I need to raise, they will hear it from my tone. That it is a soldier speaking now, not just anyone. Even at home, I think once you trained as a soldier, that thing stays with you, irrespective of where you are. So even when I walk, most women are ladies when they walk. I can't walk slowly. When I walk, it is clear that I'm walking. Dodzi Memela, who is the MK guerrilla, who infiltrated Mac Maharaj and Siphiwe Nyanda from Swaziland for Operation Vula. Memela is also the former CEO of Edulone and SASSA. She told me that she has constant fear of being arrested because of her role as a combatant infiltrating MK combatants from Swaziland to South Africa. She says, the one thing that I think continues to traumatize me, and I can only refer to it as trauma, is when I go through airports. I mean, I love traveling, but each time I pass through an airport, I think I'm going to get arrested, because I used to travel between countries to go and infiltrate people. And in many instances, I would be leaving Zimbabwe, going using a forged South African passport. And when I get to Swaziland, I think they are going to stop me. I remember once I was going with Ivan Pillay. At that particular time, I had a Swazi passport. And one of the immigration officers said to Ivan, "Oh, so we are going to arrest you for having taken our sister." So we thought we had been bussed. Little did we understand that he was basically making a joke. Ultimately, by illuminating the different eras and arenas of women's participation, the book shows the broadness of the armed struggle against apartheid as a historical truth and as a matter of gender equality and justice for an inclusive and democratic future. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof Magadla. What a fascinating insight. Thank you very much. We're going to open it up for questions now, and I'm going to hand over to Professor Sodine, who's going to handle the discussion and questions from the audience. Prof Sodine?
Sorry, colleagues, I'm a bit slow on the draw here. Great. Thank you very much, Professor Magadla. That was an absolutely extraordinary take on our history, and I have many comments to make, which I hope our colleagues will pick up, but also a way of bringing us to come to understand the difficulties of what it means to be a woman. And you show powerfully how women, as you repeatedly say, have come to shape many structures in our current profile of organizations and institutions. But you end with this deeply, and I'm going to say sad, reflection on where we are. And the story that you tell of women walking still with fear in spaces in which they ought to be acknowledged simply for their humanness and their very distinct kinds of humanness which they bring is deeply moving. So thank you very much, Prof Magadla. And so, colleagues, I'm going to ask Maputi to help me, please, to see where the reactions and responses and questions are coming from. And so I now open up. So we have a fair bit of time to allow you to respond to what Professor Magadla has shared with us and issues and questions that you may wish to raise. So over to you, please, colleagues. Can you please raise your hands? Maputi, please help me here. Any comments, please, colleagues? All right, I see Asipe. Anybody else? Anybody else, please? Can we have at least 3 or 4? If not, Asipe, can you please stimulate your colleagues in the room to join you in reflecting on Prof Magadla's input? So go ahead, please, Asipe.
Thank you so much, Prof, and thank you so much to Siphokazi for that presentation. I've read the book, I think, more than once, and I borrow from the book, particularly for my PhD, looking at the issues of students having to navigate Ukupanda in institutions of learning. Thank you so much for the scholarship that you're providing. I am soon to be a doctor because of such scholars like you, and it feels really nice to theorize and borrow from scholars who are still breathing and living, and contributing to the work. So thank you so much, Prof, for that mentorship. My question is based on this idea that you were speaking about as I entered into the room about the understanding or the need to understand death. And I wanted to ask, how did you then navigate, issues of trust, issues of ukuvulislonda with death and ethics when working with veterans, many of whom still carry that trauma and mistrust of institutions? Did it lead to you having to go back and forth to have the conversations and deciding, to stop with the conversation because it is taking someone further in terms of their trauma? And what were the spaces of healing did the project offer for the veterans who carry trauma as well as mistrust of institutions? And I think if you have time, as I'm waiting for my other colleagues, perhaps touch on this issue of consent that ethics actually requires us to submit. I've been thinking about working with older women in communities and how there is an expectation for us to offer signed consent instead of verbal consent. So how did you navigate that? Because to me, those signatures makes me feel like it's also a retrauma of the apartheid system where uyatolikelwa and someone makes you sign a document that you haven't read properly, even though they are explaining it in Xhosa. Is there space in academia for us to actually do verbal consent and taking into account different cultures as we're doing the research that we do? And I think I'll just ask another question after that. But thank you so much for that offering and for this space. Ndiyabulela.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Asipe. So let's see, there are a couple more hands now, Professor Magadla. I see Malusi Twala has raised his hand. Go ahead, please, Malusi.
Thank you. Thanks, Prof. Sudin, for the opportunity and a great, presentation from Professor Magadla. My question is, in your account, using different examples of women, from Memodis to Mekaba and so forth, there's particular defining moments which you articulate where they actually decided, to join the armed forces or to explore ways to join the armed forces. Now, in our world today, I just wanted to ask, whilst it may not be a decision to join the armed struggle in any case, but do you feel or do you have an opinion that women encounter situations and it is at a particular defining moment that they stand up or they decide to stand up against the various social ills that we face today? We appreciate or are aware that our violence as a nation is cuts across many sectors, and they will be experiencing such social ills irrespective of where they come from. Do you feel that there are certain key defining moments, and can you just highlight some of those examples if possible? Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Malusi. So let's give Hugo Canham a chance. It's really important for me just to pause here a moment, please, colleagues, and to say that we're really privileged to have the winner alongside of Professor Magadla in our presence here. Hugo, with his also absolutely fabulous a book, and really great to have you, Hugo. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Prof. Sudin, and congratulations, Professor Magadla. And I think also for this recognition of your work that is also I would describe as an astounding work for its historical work that it does. My question is related to more ordinary women combatants that are not the recognizable names, how they respond to being in your project and being, I think, rendered with such care into history. What's their response to your project? Thank you.
Okay, so thanks very much, Hugo. So, Prof Siphokazi, we've got a question about death, and I think that's a really important question. And maybe, Hugo, you also want to just pitch in there around the significance of that whole big discussion, because I think the way in which you put it to us, Professor Magadla, is about how ubiquitous, ever-present this experience is in our lives as South Africans. And we use the expression "death is everywhere." So that is raised, and then Asipe also raised this question of trust and consent, and that's a really interesting question. Malusi raised the question about defining moments of women, and then Hugo Cunham raised the question of how ordinary people have, ordinary combatants have responded to the thoughtful and sensitive way in which you have portrayed them. Go over to you, Prof Magadla. Something's happening here, colleagues.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Sudin. So let me start with the new Dr. Asipe Mtwalisa, who will be graduating in 2 weeks' time. Thank you for that question, Asipe. And I do like, to hear that you are saying that you are exploring this concept of ukupanda, and how that sort of resembles the experience of the, I would say, working class poor students in our university. This is the experience of many students in the Eastern Cape, across the country as well. We are dealing, yes, with students have to hustle in order to attain this promise of a quality education. And so I'll be curious to sort of see what you make of that concept. And in terms of the question about what it means to tell the stories, the title of the first chapter of the introduction chapter, Our Lips No Longer Sealed, is borrowed from a poem by Makhosazana Nataba, where she was reflecting about some of the challenges of the TRC. And of course, I'm aware there's a lot of work that's been done on the TRC, but the point that she was making was that there were some assumptions that the TRC process made about women's readiness to speak up. Professor Ntabiseng Motseme writes about this as well, this expectation that after defeating apartheid, the wounds of apartheid would be immediately verbalized, not understanding that some of what women went through would remain unspeakable for decades. And so the benefits then of someone like myself who comes into the research almost 20 years on is that some of that healing had already happened. Women talk about how in the early 90s, coming back into South Africa, where part of that integration process really had 2 weeks that were set up for guerrillas to go and seek therapy. So they were expected that within 2 weeks, somehow they were going to be able to work out their traumas, which of course is unreasonable. And it's been through time, once they've settled professionally, settled in terms of their families, where some of them have then had the opportunity to reflect to their families and to reflect to their peers about their expectations of this new democracy, the shift in values. And so I would say that perhaps where I was lucky was that I came in, after some of that healing had happened. And I make an example in the book about how Raymond Sadner, for instance, talks about what Thandi Modise tells Jacqueline Koch versus what she tells me and other researchers from the year 2000s onwards. So with Koch's book that comes out in 91, in this unstable period where it's still the negotiations, there's still a lot of violence, Modise paints this picture of almost perfect ANC family, where women were respected in the camps and throughout the ANC. She doesn't speak about the rampant sexual harassment and the sexual violence experienced by some of the women in the camps. And I like Satna's view to say, well, in the 1990s, it was not going to serve Modise to be so critical of her own movement at the time of political fragility, when it was still unclear how the negotiations were going. And so I make this point to say that, time has allowed much more to be speakable, and it has also then allowed women veterans to be trusting. And so perhaps connected to Hugo's question, I remember in 2022, I was going through the production process of this book, and I was showing the elders. We were at a writing workshop with the 17 women veterans that I mentioned in this project that I'm working on now. And I was showing them the photo section of the book with their captions and just wanting to be sure that they were happy with the captions. And I think they didn't believe that I was actually finishing this book. I had interviewed many of them, like Kulati, like Mamnom Sangripe, in 2013. So some time had passed and maybe they didn't quite believe that I would be able to complete the book. And I must tell you that the shift from September 2022 to when we had a workshop in April 2023, once the book was out, was really incredible, because I think it became clear to the elders that actually this story can be told, and not only can it be told, that this society is ready for this story to engage critically and creatively with their stories. And so what it has done is to really, I would say, what I see is a lot of elders who now have begun to write their own memoirs. Some beyond the chapters that they've written for this project we are working on, they are working on full memoirs. So someone like Ambassador Sikosem D, I met her in Johannesburg at the Book Circle Capital. This was now August 2023. And she said to me, I'm working on my book, and I'm going to complete it. And she did. It's a stunning memoir, and that the cover picture is her at the age of 21 addressing the United Nations General Assembly in 76. So she finished it. And with this book completed by Marion Spag, for me, it says these elders, many of them now at retirement age, some of them have the privilege to sit in with their feelings, to sit in with all the complicated feelings that come with having been liberation fighters. Because what we are grappling with in this other project is this idea that none of them regret sacrificing their youth, because they were youth. They were really teenagers. They don't regret that sacrifice. But what we are making sense of as perhaps even heartbreaking is the disappointment of what South Africa has become. So they have to hold all of that together. The values, the courage that sprang them into action as young people, and most of them in the 1970s, and actually changing, the country, changing the world by defeating apartheid and reconciling them, reconciling that reality with then having to look after their own children and their grandchildren, many of them who cannot get jobs. So a lot of them are in their 70s and they still have to work because they started working formally late on. So they don't have this 44 million that some late deputy presidents apparently have in their estates. They don't have that. They have to work not just for themselves, but they have to work for their families. So for taking time, Asipe and Hugo, is really how one gains trust, I have learned. I mean, elders that I have now known for over 10 years. So getting into this project now where they're writing their own memoirs has been easy because that trust has been established, because a lot of them had said, researchers come and then they disappear. And in fact, this story is our account. We don't owe other people our account who tend to distort what we say to them. And so the way to gain trust is really spending time. And I know I'm being long-winded, but I do want to tell this experience. This was in 2020. This was last year. I had an invitation from a journalist writing for this big British newspaper, who was saying to me that she wants to read the book and she wants to interview the women that I also interviewed. And so I said, well, and her deadline was within a couple of days. And I said, well, how are you going to do that? How are you going to establish trust? You've never met these elders. And I said, well, I'll ask them, if they're willing to do that. And the feedback I got from them, I said, well, we speak to you because we know you. We don't go around just volunteering our experience, especially for these newspapers that sort of come in and out. It's a different case when one is dealing with PhD students whom I meet, who are looking at different aspects of this history, whom many of these elders are very willing to speak to. So that's my sort of longer-winded way. I do want to respond to Prof Twala's question about these defining moments. And there's been many of these defining moments. I mean, last week we had a lecture marking the centenary of Ruth Mompati, and we were discussing there with former Minister Lindiwe Sisulu and Ambassador Tendri Mtitso about Mompati's role in the founding of the Federation of South African Women, and the courage it took women to design the Women's Charter of 1954, and the kinds of visions of equality it entailed even at that time, and how this intellectual legacy hasn't really been engaged. So someone like Shirin Hassim rightly argues that the Women's Charter of 54 and 1994 have really been neglected if we compare to how the Freedom Charter, which marks its 70th anniversary this year, has been engaged intellectually. And so there are these various moments that spring women into action. For Mompati's generation being, from 54 to 56, and she takes that heritage into exile as one of the early combatants there. But, your comment makes me think about what it has taken, for example, for the South African state to accept that we are living in a femicide society. That, again, doesn't happen on its own. It is through women's activism, which we see heightening in 2019 when a number of women are killed, many of them at universities. The state is forced to admit that they are governing a society where it is a danger to be a woman. And one can also look at the process of the Women's Coalition of the 1990s as a response to the exclusion of women in the negotiations. So when we were talking about Mombati, for instance, there's the image of her being the only woman in the team of negotiators, which women then went to challenge. And so there are all of these multiple defining moments. Of course, for this generation that I interviewed, that defining moment for many of them was 1976. I think sometimes we underestimate how incredibly transformative that moment was. Perhaps in some ways that we speak about 2015 and 2016 for the challenges of our time. I'll stop there, Prof. I know I'm being a bit long-winded. Thank you.
No apology necessary. Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof Magadla. Anybody else, colleagues? Do you see any hands, Maputi?
No hands and no comments.
All right. Nobody wants to make a closing comment? If not, I'd like to say a really big thank you to you, Prof Magadla. There have been several moments of utter poetry in the way in which you have been presenting yourself. I love the expressions and phrases that you shared with us. You've been extremely gracious in talking about how you came to be managing the mediation of this book, the 21 times, and how you say that how out of all of this you have come to see and realize where your community actually is. I loved the way in which you came to speak about these experiences, the experiences of Mamudise, of Zuleka Mandela, and most powerfully also want to say how you've come to situate these stories in this context of the long history of the last 30 years. So my really big thanks to you, and to say to you that for us on the evaluating panel, it was a really difficult decision that we had to make about your contribution and that contribution of Hugo, and we thought that both of you were bringing to us a really important intervention in our scholarship. And so my deep appreciation to you. I'd also, in closing, like to thank our chairperson for today, Prof Pillay Ansuri. Thanks very much for the introduction, Ansuri, and to Maputi in the background, Rametse, there, and for all the arrangements that you put into making this possible, and Susan Felsman, who helped you. And then also to say, finally, a big thank you to all of you. There were, from what I could see, 46 people at some point. And your presence simply affirms the decision that we've made to have these events. They're really important events in not only showcasing the excellence of our humanities contributions and scholarship in the country, but also the very distinctive nature of the South African scholarly community. I have the opportunity of traveling, in very many parts of the world, and there's something distinctive about what happens here in this part of the world. It's insistently combative, and you've showed us how that combative can work in its full scholarly amplitude, Professor Magadla. As you say, we fight to the death, and we would rather die fighting than sit watching on the sidelines. So thank you very much for helping us understand how our scholarly work is situated in this larger canvas of what scholarship means in making the world a better place. So big thank you very much. So thank you all colleagues, and hope to see you the next time we have an occasion like this. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.